Hello, it's so good to have you here. If you enjoy thrilling romances, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single story. The wind across Montana's high plains was a relentless thief, stealing warmth from a man's bones and whispers from his lips. It scoured the rolling grasslands that belonged to William, a man whose heart had been weathered as harsh and unyielding as the land itself. From the porch of his formidable ranch house, he surveyed his domain, a kingdom of cattle, horses, and profound solitude. His knuckles were white where he gripped the porch rail, his gaze fixed on the distant saw-tooth horizon, but his mind was on a more recent, more galling wound. A letter and a missing train ticket. A mail-order bride named May, who had accepted his money for passage and then vanished like smoke, leaving him feeling like the oldest fool under the vast, indifferent sky. It wasn't just the money. It was the principle. It was the confirmation of a lesson he'd learned long ago. Trust was a currency for suckers, and he had paid the price one too many times. At 40, William was a man forged in cynicism, his kindness buried deep beneath layers of suspicion. His ranch, the largest in the territory, was his fortress, and he was its solitary king, guarded by calloused hands and a locked, tight heart. That was why, when he saw the figure staggering up the long, dusty track to his house, his first instinct wasn't compassion. It was annoyance, a flicker of movement in the immense emptiness, a disruption to his bitter peace. He squinted, his pale blue eyes narrowing. It was a woman, alone, on foot, and moving with the exhausted gait of a wounded animal. As she drew closer, his annoyance hardened into pure, unadulterated suspicion. Her dress, once a respectable navy blue, was torn at the hem and coated in a layer of fine dust that turned it a ghostly gray. Her hair, a rich chestnut brown, had escaped its pins and clung to her face in sweat-dampened tendrils. She had scrapes on her hands and a dark smudge of dirt high on one cheekbone, but it was her eyes that held him. They were the color of moss after a rain, and in their depths he saw not the pleading he expected, but a profound weariness and an unshakable core of defiance. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, her chest heaving as she fought for breath. She didn't look up at him immediately, instead taking a moment to gather herself, a small act of self-preservation that struck him as oddly deliberate. When she finally did lift her head, her voice was raspy, cracked with thirst. "Sir," she began, her gaze steady despite her state, I need assistance. My stagecoach was set upon by bandits about 10 miles east of here." William remained motionless, his expression an unreadable mask of stone. He'd heard every hard-luck story the West could conjure. Drifters, grifters, and desperate souls all sang the same tune. "Bandits, you say?" he drawled, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate with the very timber of the porch. "And you, out of all the passengers, managed to wander directly to my front door. Remarkable fortune." A flicker of something, pain, or perhaps anger, crossed her features before she mastered it. "It wasn't fortune, sir. It was desperation. I followed the creek bed, hoping it would lead to a settlement." She held up her hands, showing him the raw, scraped palms. "I am not a liar. Her name," she said, "was Elizabeth. She offered no more. No family name, no destination." The omission hung in the air, a red flag to William's suspicious mind. He thought of May and the smooth, convincing words in her letters. He thought of the $300, a fortune he had sent, only to be met with silence. This woman, Elizabeth, with her torn dress and her too proud eyes, felt like the same trick in a different package. A more desperate one, perhaps, but a trick all the same. "Every soul drifting through this territory has a story," he said, his voice laced with cold dismissal. "Most of them are lies designed to separate a man from his hard-earned property. Tell me, Elizabeth, what is it you expect from me? A warm bed? A hot meal? A place to lie low until your misfortune passes?" The woman's chin lifted. The defiance he'd glimpsed in her eyes now blazed forth, clear and bright. "I expect nothing that isn't offered, sir. I'd hoped for the decency of a fellow human being. A bit of water and directions to the nearest town would suffice. I can work to earn my keep." "Work?" William let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. He gestured vaguely at the sprawling ranch around them. "This isn't a charity. My men are hired for their skill, not their sob stories. I have no place for vagrants." The word struck her like a physical blow. He saw her flinch, a slight tremor running through her exhausted frame. But she did not cry. She did not beg. She simply stood there, absorbing his contempt, her dignity a silent, infuriating shield. It was this resilience that stoked the embers of his anger into a cruel flame. He wanted to break that pride. He wanted to see her crumble, to prove to himself that she was just as weak and duplicitous as all the others. "However," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously soft tone, "I am not a man entirely without a heart, despite what you may think. I won't turn you out into the night to be prey for the coyotes." A sliver of hope entered her eyes, a vulnerability she couldn't quite conceal. It was that hope he aimed to extinguish. He pushed himself off the railing and took a step forward, looming over her from the height of the porch. His shadow fell across her, a physical manifestation of his power and his judgment. "The house is full," he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And I don't allow strangers under my roof." He paused, letting the silence stretch, savoring the cruel moment he was about to orchestrate. "But the barn is warm. The animals won't mind the company." He watched her face, waiting for the tears, the outrage, the pleading. He saw nothing but a quiet, terrible understanding dawning in her moss-green eyes. His final words were delivered like the crack of a whip, sharp and final. "So you will sleep in the stable with the horses," he commanded, before realizing his terrible mistake. He had expected a protest. He had anticipated a collapse into weeping or a tirade of insults. He got neither. Elizabeth simply held his gaze for a long, silent moment. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, filled with the harsh wind and his own thundering heartbeat. He saw the hurt in her eyes, a deep, clean wound, but it was walled off by a strength he couldn't comprehend. Then she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "As you wish, sir," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. She turned without another word, her back straight, her shoulders squared, and began the slow, weary walk toward the massive barn that stood silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. William stood frozen on the porch, the victor of a battle he hadn't realized he was fighting, yet he felt no triumph. He had issued the most debasing order he could conceive of to a woman in desperate need, and she had accepted it, with a grace that shamed him. He watched her figure recede, a solitary silhouette moving with impossible dignity toward a bed of hay. The wind whipped around him, feeling colder than before, and for the first time in a long while, William felt a chilling premonition that he had just set something in motion that he could not control. The quiet strength of her departure was a louder accusation than any scream could have ever been. Sleep was a stranger to William that night. He sat in his large leather armchair, the ledger book open on his lap, but the columns of figures blurred into meaningless squiggles. The fire in the stone hearth crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cavernous room, but it offered no warmth against the chill that had settled deep in his gut. The silence of the house, usually a comfort, felt accusatory. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to be counting the seconds of his own small-minded cruelty. He kept replaying the scene on the porch, the exhaustion in Elizabeth's eyes, the dust on her face, the unwavering dignity in her posture as she accepted his vile command. He had wanted to see her break, to affirm his bleak view of the world. Instead, her quiet compliance had broken something in him. A wire of unease, thin but sharp, hummed beneath his skin. It was the same feeling he got when a storm was brewing over the mountains, an instinct that the atmosphere had changed, that something significant and potentially destructive was on its way. He told himself it was just his conscience, a rusty mechanism he rarely used. He'd dealt harshly with people before. It was necessary to survive, to protect what was his. But this felt different. This wasn't a calculated business decision or the dismissal of a lazy ranch hand. This was a deliberate act of humiliation aimed at a woman who was already at her lowest ebb. Unable to sit still, he rose and paced the room. He went to the window, peering out into the inky blackness toward the barn. A single lantern cast a weak golden glow from a high window, a solitary beacon in the vast darkness. Was she awake, weeping into the hay, cursing his name? The not knowing gnawed at him. He needed to see. He needed to confirm his judgment. Or perhaps, though he wouldn't admit it to himself, he needed to see that he was wrong. Pulling on his boots and shrugging into a heavy coat, he slipped out the back door. The wind had died down, leaving the air crisp and cold. The scent of pine and distant snow hung in the night. He moved with the quiet tread of a man who knew his own land, his footsteps muffled by the dirt path. The massive barn doors were closed, but a smaller side door was unlatched. He eased it open, the hinges groaning softly, and slipped inside. The familiar warmth of the barn enveloped him, a comforting mix of animal heat, clean hay, and worn leather. The soft shuffling and contented sighs of his horses filled the cavernous space. He paused in the shadows, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light cast by the lantern hanging from a central beam. He scanned the empty stalls, expecting to find her huddled in a corner, a miserable heap of sorrow, but she wasn't there. His gaze was drawn to the far end of the barn, to the large birthing stall, and that's when he heard it, a low, soothing voice, murmuring soft words of encouragement. He moved silently along the central aisle, keeping to the deepest shadows, his curiosity now a powerful, driving force. When he peered around the edge of the stall, the sight that met his eyes stopped his heart. There was Elizabeth on her knees in the clean straw. Her face, illuminated by the lantern light, was a study in calm concentration. The smudges of dirt were still there, but they no longer looked like signs of destitution. Now they seemed like the marks of honest labor. Before her, his most prized mare, Starlight, a beautiful palomino with a bloodline worth a small fortune, was in the throes of a difficult labor. The mare was slick with sweat, her eyes wide with pain and fear, her powerful body trembling. William's own foreman, a man with 20 years of experience, had been watching the mare for days, predicting an easy birth. Clearly, he had been wrong. This was a breech birth, the foal's hind legs emerging first, a dangerous, often fatal complication. Yet Elizabeth was not panicked. She spoke to the mare in a continuous, gentle murmur, her hands moving with an expertise that stunned him. "Easy now, girl," she whispered, her voice a balm against the animal's fear. "Easy, Starlight, we'll get through this together. You are strong. You can do this." She had one hand on the mare's heaving flank, a gesture of reassurance, while with the other she was gently, skillfully working to reposition the foal. It was a delicate, dangerous maneuver that William had only seen his veterinarian attempt. One wrong move could injure both mare and foal beyond saving. He watched, breathless, as she waited for a contraction to pass, then worked with a swift, certain touch. Her torn dress was forgotten. Her exhaustion seemed to have vanished, replaced by a deep well of competence and compassion. Time seemed to slow down. The only sounds were the mare's strained breathing, Elizabeth's calming voice, and the frantic pounding of William's own heart against his ribs. He was a trespasser, witnessing a sacred, private moment. This woman whom he had condemned to sleep with animals as an insult was communing with them, saving them, with a grace and skill he had never witnessed. With a final great effort from the mare and Elizabeth's expert guidance, the foal slipped free into the straw, a perfect leggy creature who shook its head as if in surprise at its sudden entry into the world. Elizabeth immediately went to work, clearing the foal's airways with a scrap of clean cloth she produced from a pocket, her movements efficient and sure. Starlight, exhausted but victorious, lowered her head to nuzzle her newborn, nickering softly. Elizabeth sat back on her heels, a tired but profoundly beautiful smile gracing her lips as she watched the new mother and child. In that moment, bathed in the golden lantern light, surrounded by the miracle of new life she had just midwifed, she looked less like a vagrant and more like a queen in her throne room. William backed away, his movements clumsy in his haste. He slipped out of the barn, his mind reeling. The foundation of his certainty had been shattered. He had judged her, condemned her, and been utterly, unequivocally wrong. The mistake was no longer just a premonition. It was a living, breathing reality, as real as the tiny foal now taking its first wobbly breaths in his barn. The next morning, the sun rose into a sky of brilliant, unforgiving blue. William had barely slept. He watched from the house as Elizabeth emerged from the barn, her movements stiff but purposeful. She went to the water pump, washed her face and hands, and neatly braided her long hair. There was no sign of her ordeal, save for the deep weariness that still clung to her, just as the foreman, Arthur, a stout man with a weathered face, was coming to report the night's unexpected arrival. A rider appeared on the horizon. William recognized the proud posture and the piebald stallion immediately. It was Yiska, a Cheyenne elder with whom he had a long-standing and respectful trading relationship. Yiska was a man of few words but immense integrity, his wisdom as deep as the canyons. Yiska dismounted with a fluid grace that defied his age, his dark, intelligent eyes taking in everything. "William," he greeted with a nod, "I have come to see the new colt you promised me." "Yiska, you're welcome here always," William replied, his voice strained. "The colt is in the east pasture, but we had another birth last night, a fine filly out of Starlight." As they spoke, Elizabeth walked past them, carrying 2 buckets of fresh water toward the barn. She kept her eyes down, intending to be invisible, but she wasn't. Yiska stopped mid-sentence, His entire demeanor changed. His stoic expression softened into one of stunned recognition and profound respect. He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth. "It cannot be," he said, his voice a low, reverent whisper. He spoke a phrase in the Cheyenne language, a term of honor. Elizabeth froze, the bucket still in her hands. She looked up, and her eyes met Yiska's. A flicker of recognition, and something like sorrow passed through her gaze. "Yiska," she said softly, her voice barely audible. William stared between them, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "You know this woman." Yiska turned to William, and for the first time William saw not a trading partner, but a tribal leader in his full authority. There was a fire in his eyes that made William feel small. "Know her?" Yiska's voice was incredulous. "William, this woman is known to my people as Mihene the Eagle Heart. 2 winters ago, when the Powder River flooded its banks with the spring thaw, my own grandson, Bidziel, was swept from his horse into the torrent. We thought he was lost, but this woman, this Eagle Heart, rode her horse into the raging water without hesitation. She pulled him from the river's grasp when my bravest warriors could not reach him. She saved the son of my son." Yiska turned back to Elizabeth and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of immense respect. "She is a hero to the Cheyenne. We have searched for her since that day, to offer her the honor she is due, but she vanished." The world tilted under William's feet. The crisp morning air felt thick, unbreathable. Yiska's words echoed in the terrible silence of his mind. A hero, Eagle Heart. He looked at Elizabeth, the woman he had called a vagrant, a liar, the woman he had ordered to sleep in the dirt like an animal. He saw the scrapes on her hands, the weariness in her frame, and understood they were not badges of shame, but the marks of a desperate flight. His terrible mistake was no longer just a feeling. It had a name, it had a face, and it was standing right in front of him holding 2 buckets of water, her quiet dignity the most damning judgment of all. The silence that followed Yiska's revelation was more profound than the vast emptiness of the plains. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with William's shame and Elizabeth's quiet discomfort. The morning sun, which moments before had felt clean and promising, now seemed to cast a harsh, interrogating light upon him. He could feel the eyes of his own ranch hands, who had paused in their morning chores, drawn by the scene at the main house. He could feel the steady, disappointed gaze of Yiska, but most of all, he felt the weight of Elizabeth's moss-green eyes, which held not triumph or accusation, but a deep, sorrowful weariness, as if this was just one more burden she had to bear. Arthur, his foreman, stood frozen, the report about the new foal forgotten on his lips, his mouth slightly agape. William's authority, the very bedrock of his identity on this ranch, had crumbled to dust in the space of a single minute. He was no longer the master of his domain. He was a fool exposed. His voice, when he finally found it, was a raw, unfamiliar thing. I did not know," he stammered, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. He looked at Elizabeth, truly looked at her, and saw not the vagrant he had imagined, but the hero Yiska described. The strength was there, in the set of her jaw, in the unwavering line of her back. How had he been so blind? "Move her things into the house," he barked, his voice rough with self-loathing. He turned to Arthur, his command a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control. "The main guest room, immediately." Arthur blinked, then nodded quickly, hurrying to do his bidding. Elizabeth spoke for the first time, her voice low but clear. "Sir, that is not necessary. It is necessary," William cut her off, unable to bear the politeness in her tone. It felt like a sharper rebuke than any curse. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if a physical barrier of his own making stood between them. "What I did, what I said, there is no excuse for it. My apology, Miss—" He trailed off, realizing he didn't even know her last name. "It is just Elizabeth," she said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "And an apology is not required. You were protecting your home. I understand." But she didn't understand. She couldn't possibly know the bitter poison of betrayal that had curdled his soul, the one that made him see a threat in every shadow and a lie on every tongue. Her grace was a mirror, reflecting his own ugliness back at him tenfold. Yiska watched the exchange, his face impassive, but his eyes held a deep, ancient wisdom. He knew this was a matter for William to resolve himself. With a final, respectful nod to Elizabeth, the elder turned. "I will see the colt another day, William. It seems you have matters of the house to attend to." With that, he swung onto his piebald stallion and rode away, leaving William alone to face the consequences of his monumental error. The days that followed were a study in quiet tension. Elizabeth was moved into the finest room in the house, a large chamber with a soft feather bed, clean linens, and a window that overlooked the sprawling valley. William dispatched a rider to the nearest town with a list, and by evening, a selection of ready-made dresses, sturdy boots, and toiletries lay waiting for her. He offered these things with a stiff, formal apology, his words sounding clumsy and rehearsed, even to his own ears. Elizabeth accepted them with a quiet gratitude that kept him at arm's length. "Thank you, Mr. Hatcher," she would say, using his surname like a shield. "You are very generous." She did not lounge in her new comfort. She rose with the sun, just as she had in the barn. She insisted on earning her keep, and since he had forbidden her from mucking stalls, she found other ways to be useful. She had a deft hand with a needle and thread, mending the ranch hand's clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She helped Mildred, the stout, kind-hearted housekeeper in the kitchen, her movements efficient and her presence calming, but her true domain remained the barn. She spent hours with Starlight and the new foal, which she had named Dawn. William would watch from a distance, hidden in the shadows of the tack room, as she groomed the mare or simply sat in the hay, speaking softly to the animals. There was a peace about her in their presence, a sense of belonging that he had so cruelly denied her. Her skill was undeniable. She diagnosed a case of colic in one of the geldings before Arthur even saw the signs, mixing a remedy of herbs and warm water that had the horse back on its feet by morning. Slowly, grudgingly, William began to rely on her judgment. He started asking her opinion on the horses, first casually, then with genuine interest. Their conversations were brief, strictly about feed ratios, hoof care, and bloodlines, but they were the first fragile threads of a bridge being built across the chasm of his shame. He saw an intelligence in her that was sharp and practical, a quiet confidence that had no need for boastful words. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, he found her on the porch, watching the sun bleed purple and orange across the horizon. A cool breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. He had intended to walk past, to leave her to her thoughts, but something compelled him to stop. He leaned against the post, mirroring her posture from that first day, though the power dynamic was now completely inverted. "The foal is strong," he said, his voice softer than usual. "She has her mother's spirit," Elizabeth replied, not looking at him, "and her father's legs. She'll be fast." They stood in silence for a few moments, a comfortable quiet that would have been unthinkable a week prior. "I need you to understand," William began, the words coming out in a rush before he could stop them. "Why I was the way I was." Elizabeth finally turned her head, her gaze curious and patient. He took a deep breath, the confession feeling like a stone being pulled from his throat. "I was expecting someone, a woman from back east, a mail-order bride." He said the words with a self-deprecating grimace. "Her name was May. We corresponded for months. I thought, well, it doesn't matter what I thought. I sent her money for the train ticket, a considerable sum. She never arrived. The letter was returned. The money was gone." He stared out at the fading light, his shame a raw, open wound. "It wasn't the first time I've been made a fool of by a woman with a convincing story. So when you appeared, looking like you'd been through hell with no explanation, I saw only what I expected to see. Another trick, another lie." He finally met her eyes. "It's not an excuse, but it's the truth." Elizabeth listened without interruption. When he finished, she didn't offer platitudes or scorn. She simply nodded, a deep and knowing sadness in her eyes. "A wounded animal will bite any hand that comes near," she said softly. "Even one that means to help." Her understanding was more disarming than any forgiveness. It invited a confidence of its own. "And you, Elizabeth?" he asked gently. "Yiska said you vanished. The bandits on the stagecoach. Were they just common thieves?" A shadow passed over her face. She hugged her arms to her chest as if warding off a chill. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They weren't. They were looking for me." She hesitated, then continued, her gaze fixed on the darkening plains as if she could see her past, chasing her across them. "My father left me a small inheritance, land back in Ohio. Not much, but it was mine. My uncle, his brother, believes it belongs to him. He is not a good man. When I refused to sign it over, he made it clear I was no longer safe." She took a shaky breath. "So I sold what I could, bought a ticket as far west as it would take me, and I ran. I thought if I went far enough he would give up, But his reach is longer than I imagined. The men on that coach, they weren't trying to rob the passengers. They were trying to abduct me. Now it was William's turn to understand. Her desperation, her secrecy, her flight, it all clicked into place. She wasn't running from nothing. She was running from a very real, very specific danger, and she had run straight into his own fortress of bitterness. "You are safe here," he said, the words a solemn vow. It was more than a promise, it was an act of penance. "I give you my word, no one will harm you on this land." She looked at him then, and for the first time, the cautious shield in her eyes lowered, revealing a glimmer of trust. A fragile, tentative warmth spread between them, chasing away some of the evening chill. The hostility was gone, replaced by a shared vulnerability, a quiet acknowledgement of past wounds. And in its place, a new tension began to hum in the air, an awareness of his hand resting on the porch rail, only inches from hers, the way the last light of dusk caught the chestnut highlights in her hair, the unexpected pull he felt just to stand there in the quiet with her. It was a current, subtle but powerful, and it promised that the story between them was far from over. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of shared labor and quiet discovery. The sharp edges of William's guilt began to smooth under the steady balm of Elizabeth's presence. He found himself seeking her out, not just for her expertise with the horses, but for the simple, grounding peace of her company. He learned the cadence of her speech, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of the Ohio forests she missed, and the small, determined set of her jaw when she was focused on a task. He discovered a dry wit that occasionally surfaced, catching him off guard and drawing a rare, genuine laugh from his chest. For her part, Elizabeth began to see the man beneath the armor of bitterness. She saw the fierce loyalty he showed his men, the fairness with which he conducted his business, and the deep, unspoken love he had for the unforgiving land he'd tamed. She saw the way he watched her, his gaze a mixture of regret and a burgeoning warmth that made her heart beat a little faster. The ranch no longer felt like a temporary refuge. It was beginning to feel like home. The fear of her uncle's men had receded to a dull ache, a ghost story from a life that felt a world away. They were in the main corral one late afternoon, working together to gentle a young, spirited colt. The air was warm, thick with the smell of horsehide and dry earth. William was demonstrating a technique, his voice low and steady as he spoke to the animal, when Elizabeth, standing by the fence, suddenly went rigid. Her head snapped up, her gaze fixed on the long track leading to the house. William followed her line of sight. 3 riders were approaching, moving at a confident, deliberate pace. They were not cowboys, and they were not Cheyenne. They were strangers, dressed in dark, city-worn clothes that looked out of place against the vast landscape, and they rode with an arrogance that set every one of William's protective instincts on fire. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Go inside, lock the door and stay with Mildred." But she was frozen, her face pale, all the color drained from it. "It's them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's Frederick. My uncle's man." The name meant nothing to him, but the terror in her eyes told him everything. The ghost story had just become flesh and blood. "Go, now," he commanded, but this time it was not an order of dominance but a plea of protection. He vaulted over the corral fence, his mind racing. He shouted for Arthur and the other hands, his voice a sharp crack in the peaceful afternoon. Men came running from the bunkhouse and the barn, grabbing rifles from the racks he insisted they keep ready. But the riders were already too close. The leader, a man with a cruel sneer and cold, dead eyes, Frederick presumably, brought his horse to a halt just yards from the porch. His 2 companions fanned out on either side of him. "William Hatcher," Frederick called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have no quarrel with you. We're here for the girl. Elizabeth, send her out and we'll be on our way. No one needs to get hurt." William walked forward, positioning himself squarely between the riders and his house. He held a Winchester rifle, its weight familiar and steady in his hands. "The only one leaving this ranch is you," he said, his voice a low growl. "Either on your horse or over it, your choice." Frederick's sneer widened. "Playing the hero, rancher. She's not worth your life." He glanced at the house. "Elizabeth, I know you can hear me. Don't let these good men die for you. Come on out." The front door opened, but it wasn't a surrendering Elizabeth who appeared. It was Elizabeth holding a shotgun, her knuckles white, her face a mask of resolute fury. The terror was gone, replaced by the blazing defiance of the woman who had charged into a raging river. She was Eagleheart, and this was her territory to defend. "You will not set foot in this house, Frederick," she called out, her voice ringing with a strength that made William's heart swell with pride. "How you will not harm these people. Leave now." That was all the invitation Frederick needed. With a guttural yell, he spurred his horse forward, drawing a pistol from his belt. The air exploded with the roar of gunfire. The next few minutes were a chaotic blur of smoke, shouting, and the terrified whinnying of horses. William fired, taking cover behind a water trough, his movements precise and deadly. His men returned fire from the bunkhouse and the barn, creating a crossfire. But the attackers were professionals, using their horses for cover, advancing relentlessly. One of the hands went down, clutching his shoulder, and Elizabeth, without a moment's hesitation, pulled him back into the cover of the doorway, ripping a piece of her skirt to staunch the bleeding. She was not a liability in this fight, she was its heart. Her courage was a tangible thing, a force that inspired the men around her. William saw her reload the shotgun, her hands steady, her eyes scanning the fray, and he knew in that moment that his life had irrevocably changed. He wasn't just fighting for his land, he was fighting for her, for their home. One of the attackers went down. A cry of pain cut short as Arthur's aim found its mark. But Frederick was wily. He dismounted, using the chaos to circle around toward the side of the house, trying to get a clear shot at Elizabeth in the doorway. William saw the maneuver and his blood ran cold. He broke cover, running to intercept him, firing his rifle as he moved. "Elizabeth, get back!" he roared. Just as Frederick raised his pistol, a new sound cut through the din of the battle, a high, piercing cry that was not of a man or a horse. It was a war cry. Over the rise behind the attackers, a line of riders appeared, their faces painted, their movements swift and silent as ghosts. Plieska, astride his piebald, led the charge, a dozen Cheyenne warriors at his back. They descended like a hawk upon a snake, their arrows flying with lethal accuracy. The remaining gunman looked up in shock, an arrow embedding itself in his chest before he could even process the new threat. Frederick, his plans shattered, turned to flee, but he found his path blocked by William. They faced each other for a final desperate second before William's fist connected with the man's jaw, sending him sprawling into the dust. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Silence descended, broken only by the panting breaths of the survivors and the soft thud of hooves as Yiska's warriors secured the area. William stood over the groaning form of Frederick, his chest heaving, his rifle still smoking. He looked up, and his eyes found Elizabeth. She was standing on the porch, the shotgun held loosely at her side. Her face was smudged with gunpowder, her hair was a mess, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The distance between them was only 30 yards, but it felt like a sacred space, charged with the life-and-death struggle they had just shared. He walked toward her, his legs feeling unsteady. Yiska and his men were efficiently tying up Frederick, their movements a testament to a lifetime of such conflicts, but William saw only her. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, the same spot where she had stood on that first day. But everything was different. He was looking up at her now, not in judgment, but in awe. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She shook her head, her moss-green eyes searching his face. "Are you?" "No," he said. He took the last few steps until he was standing before her. He gently took the heavy shotgun from her hands and leaned it against the railing. Then he reached out and cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a smudge of powder from her cheek. "When I first saw you," he began, his voice thick, "I made the worst mistake of my life. I saw weakness where there was strength. I saw deceit where there was honor." He looked into her eyes, letting her see the truth and the raw vulnerability in his own. "I was a blind fool, Elizabeth, but that terrible mistake, it led me to you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "My whole life I've built this place," he continued, gesturing to the ranch around them. "This land, these herds, this house. I thought it was my home, but it was just a place, a fortress. It wasn't a home until you walked into it. Even when I sent you to the barn, you made it a place of life, of hope. You are the heart of this ranch, Elizabeth. You are the heart of my home." He took both of her hands in his, their calluses fitting together perfectly. "I don't want you to stay here because you have nowhere else to go. I want you to stay here because it's where you belong, with me." He swallowed. The next words, the most important he would ever speak. "Marry me, Elizabeth, not as payment for a debt or out of duty, but because I love you." A single tear finally traced a path through the dust on her cheek. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, transforming her features with a light that outshone the setting sun. "My place was never in the stable," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "It was always here with you." She squeezed his hands. "Yes, William. Yes, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of smoke and courage and home. The battle was over. The ghosts of the past were vanquished. And in the quiet aftermath, under the vast Montana sky, a new life, a shared life, built on the ashes of a terrible mistake and redeemed by a profound love, was just beginning. True character is not defined by one's circumstances, but by one's actions in the face of them. This story teaches us that first impressions, clouded by our own past wounds and pride, can be profoundly wrong. It shows that true strength is found in dignity and compassion, and that the most humbling mistakes can lead to the most profound redemptions and the most unexpected love. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.